in which the deer um, highlight the ways in which the Deerfield River watershed is maybe a little bit unique. Let's move on to the next slide. So we've developed this model. You can see right away in the screenshot here, this is a screenshot from the model. You can see the degree of the degree of detail in which we've incorporated the Massachusetts portions of the watershed. And it's a little bit more simplified in Vermont. We're not forgetting about that runoff because that's really important. There's a lot of runoff that's generated in Vermont, and it comes downstream and affects you all. So we certainly haven't forgotten about that. But we've added a really significant amount of detail to the model within Massachusetts. We've got nearly 60 dams incorporated into the model, over 350 bridges and culvert crossings. We have more than 60 miles of the Deerfield River itself, and then over 200 miles of the Deerfield's tributaries incorporated into the model. We didn't create all of this from scratch. We relied on a lot of really great information, some of which is has been gathered at the state or federal level, but a lot of it has been gathered at the watershed scale, and you all have been a part of that for many years. And so there was a lot of great existing information that we made sure to incorporate into the model, so we weren't sort of recreating the wheel, so to speak. Next slide. We did, however, gather a lot of really important field data, right? There was a lot of great existing information, but we had identified some data gaps last summer, and we sort of prioritized them, which data gaps were the most important to fill, and which ones were the least important, right? So in these screenshots, red is the most important, and yellow is middle, green is least important or complete. And so you can kind of get a sense for before our field investigations last summer with FERCOG, we had a number of data gaps that were really quite critical to the model's accuracy. But by the end of the field effort last summer, those were largely resolved. And so that was a really important part of this project, was going out there and taking field measurements at various crossings and dams and filling those data gaps. And a couple of small data gaps remain, and we can continue to work away on those. But certainly most of them are filled, and we're in a really good position to develop a robust model. So the model includes both one-dimensional components like stream center lines and pipes, right? Storm drains and spillways and culverts, but it also has this two-dimensional mesh over the top of all of those one-dimensional features. And this is really where the Deerfield River flood model shines, right? It's got more than 34 square miles of two-dimensional coverage. And the two-dimensional mesh is really important. It does a couple of things. It accounts for all that floodplain storage, which is really important. Right, so it's floodplain storage, but it's also those overland flow paths. Water doesn't just move down channels, it also moves in the floodplains and in critical overland flow paths. It also, in more developed areas, moves down streets when storm drains become overwhelmed and the water rises and comes out of catch basins and manholes. There are places in the watershed where it runs down streets and through backyards and parking lots. And so that's what the two-dimensional mesh represents in the model. Next slide. The two-dimensional mesh is this really dynamic piece of the model. You can kind of get a sense here in the screenshot. There's the two-dimensional mesh is basically lots of different cells. In fact, we have over 150,000 cells, and they range in size from about 50 feet to 250 feet. And it's a balancing act. We want to make them as small as possible because it makes the model and its outputs as detailed as possible, but it also takes the model longer to run. I'll tell you, this model takes longer to run than any model we've ever built before, because we wanted to add as much detail as possible. And I've apologized to Sydney many times for the fact that this takes over 2 days to run, but it offers really great detailed output. But we've sort of taken pains to make sure that we've we've got these really small 2D cells in the most developed areas. We've concentrated those small cells in, in the channels and immediate floodplains themselves, and in areas where there's quite a bit of development. And then we've we've used larger cells in areas that are less developed or areas of large open water bodies. Next slide. And right, we developed this model, but we wanted to make sure that we could trust its output. And so we've gone through this calibration and validation process. And the calibration process is basically iteratively tweaking some of the input parameters to the model until we maximize the agreement between what the model is spitting out and what has been historically observed in your watershed. And so we focused in on the July 2023 flood. It's a recent significant flood event with really great data available from NOAA as far as rainfall records and also from the USGS in terms of stream flow records. Right, so this July 2023 event was experienced differently in different parts of the watershed, but between 3 and 6 inches of rain fell, and it was on the order of a 25 to 50 year flood event. So it's a really significant flood event. It makes a really good calibration event. And on the next slide, you can see we've focused in on 5 USGS gauges where we have compared what the model's spitting out to what the USGS recorded for stream flow and river levels at 5 different locations in the watershed. And there's general guidance on how well these things should match. We have tried to reproduce peak flow rates to within -15 to +25%. And we've tried to reproduce runoff volumes to within -10 to 20%. And we've been really successful here. This is a really robust model, and it's producing really accurate results. And you'll see that on the next slide, where we've zoomed into a particular USGS gauge. This is the Charlemont gauge. It's sort of about halfway down, maybe 2/3 down the Deerfield River. You can see in this graph that the black line is what the USGS observed going by that point in the stream. You can see during that July 2023 flood event, the river flow rises up over the course of a day or two and then slowly recedes. And the gray line, the model output, same thing. Really nice match with the flood kind of rising. A really nice match to the peak of the storm. And then also capturing that, what's called the falling limb, which is difficult to reproduce generally, but a really nice match in this case. So you can see that we were able to reproduce historical observations to within a couple percent, which has been honestly the highlight of my career. I've not been involved with a model this accurate, and I've told Cindy many times that this is as good as it gets. Your career is downhill from now on. We'll see if she believes me.
Not yet. Yeah.
No, yeah. But we didn't just calibrate that model to the one event. We wanted to make sure that it reproduced historical observations well for a wide range of storms. So of course we wanted to test it with Tropical Storm Irene, right? Perhaps in many areas, this is a storm of record. This is on the order of 100-year storm event. Anywhere between 5 and 8 inches of rain fell over 24 hours in different corners of the watershed, and as you'll see on the next slide, when we run this event through the watershed, again, we get really great agreement. There's less USGS data available for Irene because it was such a large flood event. It kind of flooded out some of their gauges. So there's less information in terms of flow rates, but they do still have some useful data as far as flood depths. And so regardless of how you look at it, the model does a really nice job of reproducing this sort of storm of record in the watershed. And so that makes us feel like we can use this model to look at future sort of theoretical flooding conditions, and also to look at and evaluate some potential flood mitigation solutions. And so real quick, you saw this last time. I won't spend too much time on it. I'll let Cindy get to chatting about some of the solutions and scenarios we've looked at. But real quick, we use the model to look at present and future flood risk. You folks have probably seen a graph like this before. It does a nice job of showing how much total rainfall depth and peak rainfall intensity is expected to increase as climate change advances. So, for example, the 500-year storm of today is expected to be the 100-year storm by 2050. And something more moderate, like a 25-year storm of today, will be the 10-year storm by 2030, and the 5-year storm by 2070. So some really significant um, uh, changes in the intensity and depth of rainfall events. And so we've run that through the model. We've run 6 different storm events, as you'll see on the next slide. We've tried to pair events where we're looking at, right? So we've looked at the 2, 10, and 100-year events of a baseline climate compared to a 2070 climate. We like to pair them so it's easy to compare, right? We can look at the 2-year of today and the 2-year of tomorrow, and so on. But we also like the way these total rainfall depths are distributed, right? They're not bunched up. We've got a low 3, a medium 3, we've got a 4, a 5, a 6, a 9. So there's this nice spread of design rainfall depths, and we've run these through the model, and we've looked at what that means for present and future flood risk. We've looked at it in a couple of different ways. The first way we looked at it was, how is runoff expected to change? Throughout the watershed, the runoff coming off the land, how is that going to change? You've seen this slide before, so I won't spend too much time on it, but the punchline is that the volume of runoff coming off the land is expected to increase by between about 30 and 60%. The greater the intensity of the storm, the greater their percent increase. So for storms like the 2 and the 10-year event, those are expected to increase about 30% between a baseline climate and a 2070 climate. A more extreme storm like the 100-year, we may see increases of up to 60%. And so these are some really significant increases in runoff volumes. So, tens of thousands of football fields filled up to 1 foot of flood depth. So some really significant flood volumes to have to manage or mitigate or adapt to in your watershed. One last way we'll look at, or second to last way we'll look at it, is in terms of inundated area, right? Not just the volume of water coming off the land, but what does that mean for the floodplain? How much is the floodplain expected to increase? So, for example, when we look at the increase in the inundated area in the watershed, we see increases anywhere from 10 to 15, 16%. So these percentages are lower, but right, so we're talking hundreds of football fields more of flooding. But those have important, right? These percentages are lower maybe than the runoff volumes, but these have important impacts. And you'll see that on the next slide, where we've zoomed in to individual downtowns and developed areas to better understand what these increases in flooding mean. This is a nice example from Shelburne. You can see we've called out 2 pieces of critical infrastructure, right? A fire station and a school. And we've compared the flooding, and these are screenshots sort of straight from the model. You can see areas of blue indicate flooding. The darker the blue, the greater the flooding depth. And so on the left is the 100-year storm of today, and on the right is the 100-year storm of 2070. So there's some really nice takeaways here. At the bottom of both images, you can see some areas of worsened flooding where that blue has gotten darker. Right, this Bridge Street area, you can see the flooding has gone from maybe 6 inches to a foot. By 2070, that might be 1.5 feet, 2 feet of flooding, which is very different. You also see some areas of new flooding. There's this area around Main Street, which has managed to stay relatively dry during the 100-year of today, but the 100-year flood in 2070, we see up to 1.5 feet of flooding on Main Street where we didn't before. And that has real impacts to this community. It affects critical infrastructure as well. If you look at that fire station, the fire station stays high and dry during the 100-year of today, but by 2070, the fire station and certainly its driveway are now, under 1 feet, 1.5 feet, 2 feet of flooding, and that has real impacts to emergency responses. And so this is the type of output coming out of the model, and it gives us a sense for the scale flooding impacts, both in terms of runoff volume in the landscape and inundated area in the various floodplains, but also sort of the town scale, the main street scale impacts to roadways and buildings and critical infrastructure. And so the model's been really helpful in highlighting some of these impacts. And so we've started to look at some potential solutions. And I'll hand it off to Sydney to talk about some of the solutions we've been looking at the last month or two.
Great. Yes, this is the next progression of our model was looking at some nature-based solutions. So a little bit of background. Nature-based solutions are more working with natural processes rather than against them. We're trying to mimic the natural environment to help reduce flooding, safeguard public health, clean air, natural hazard resilience. So they tackle multiple challenges simultaneously. So not just focus on the flooding, but these ancillary effects as well. So we can kind of see that they focus on delivering environmental, social, and economic benefits. And when they're designed properly, they can be very cost-effective investments to help the community and help with long-term planning for reducing runoff. So here's kind of a various kind of snapshot of different flood mitigation strategies that are based upon nature-based solutions. These are, again, more general ones. Not all of them can be applied to the Deerfield, but we just wanted to show that there's definitely different scales that we can look at. So looking at the watershed-wide scales, these ones are more focused on local regulations or way to create incentives for change across the entire regional watershed. One example is through bylaw updates, trying to require any new development or redevelopment in the watershed to be able to capture and store runoff on site from a rain event. Another way is to have kind of a impervious percent reduction, impervious surface reduction goal for the entire watershed to try to reduce impervious runoff, because that is the fastest way runoff kind of hits the ground and gets into the rest of your watershed. And then shifting to more kind of large scale solutions. One of these could be looking at modifying dam impoundments, either through raising the existing height of a dam or lowering surface water levels before the storm hits to kind of create more storage. Another example of a large scale solution would be looking at a dry detention basin to try to temporarily, again, capture and hold large volumes of water to reduce your peak flow. And then another one as well is looking at storm or reactivating the floodplain kind of stream restoration in order to try to kind of hold back the flow or slow down the flow that is running through your channels. You can do this through increasing sinuosity or trying to undo channelization. And then shifting finally to some small scale examples. Again, these are much more localized individuals, things that you can do to reduce runoff and flooding extents. One is floodable spaces, to try to have areas in your public space that you could temporarily flood to hold the water there before it continues into your piped infrastructure. And another one could be porous pavement to try to, if you need to have these paved surfaces, when the water falls on them, have this porous pavement so it can kind of pass through instead of immediately becoming runoff. So again, this is kind of just a suite of various solutions that we have looked at for previous watersheds and that we also looked at for the Deerfield watershed. And as I said, these are different scales of solutions. So we also wanted to analyze the results of those strategies at different scales. So as we know, we started out with 549 subcatchments. This is what directly makes up the model. However, it's pretty hard to analyze 549 different subcatchments. So we aggregated those up to the catchment level on the Massachusetts side. So these were aggregated hydrologically based off their hydrologic connections. And we did this to try to better analyze more locally, what could we expect to be the change in runoff in a specific part of the watershed. And again, we're looking at this only on the Massachusetts side to look at the catchment level solutions. And then if we wanted to aggregate this further into a sub-watershed, that could be done to 29 sub-watersheds. again, to look more at a whole river ecosystem, such as the Cold River as a whole, or the South River as a whole. So again, these are just different ways that we can aggregate the results to try to look at them as we are looking at these different solutions. And switching back to the catchment scale briefly, once we had defined these catchments, we ranked them. We gave them a nature-based solution score from 1 to 5, 1 being low priority, 5 being high, to try to see which catchments would be good to look at and analyze further for some of these smaller solutions. So again, it's more stuff that we're trying to find a localized benefit. So we looked at stuff like total inundation area, flood volume, soil group, just to try to weight and analyze how effective could nature-based solutions be in these various catchments. And again, to try to rank them to choose for this next slide. So here is kind of the synopsis of what we've been looking at. So we've been looking at 6 different nature-based solution scenarios, both, again, across the watershed. So the larger scale solutions are on the top, and they kind of peter down to these smaller solution scales on the bottom. So kind of doing a brief run through, we're calling scenario 1 the increased dam storage capacity scenario. So we looked at identifying dams across the watershed that we could allow additional storage for. So we identified, and I'll go into this more later, but we looked at 48 dams across the watershed that we thought we could impact or affect to allow them to store more storage. So this is a watershed-wide solution, but it is focused on fewer, larger, dam scale projects. Another one is the ordinance or bylaw updates. This is very much throughout the entire watershed, trying to look at what areas could be eligible for new development or redevelopment, and if this occurred, what would happen if they stored the 100-year present-day rainfall event, which for the Deerfield River is 6.7 inches. So, and again, we'll go into that more later, but you can kind of see on the image, the light gray is areas we identified as new development possibilities, and then the darker gray are the redevelopment. And then going into culvert upsizing, that is our third scenario. So we wanted to look at a bunch of different culvert projects that could be across the watershed, and what would happen if we widened certain culverts to prevent the risk of road overtopping during flood events. And we identified 84 to look at. And then after that, going into the 3 smaller ones, after we looked at the culvert upsizing, we wanted to pick an area where we thought had a good benefit from the culvert upsizing, but we also wanted to see what would happen if we input some of the smaller scale solutions along with this culvert upsizing. So we picked the Cherry Run Brook Plaza for that scenario. We wanted to zoom into that one, so it has that little image on the top circle there. Then for scenarios 5 and 6, those were chosen from that previous catchment ranking slide where we wanted to focus on catchments that had a high possibility or could see a high benefit from nature-based solutions. So the 2 that were chosen were the Ashfield Town Beach and the Green River Swimming and Rec area. So in those 2 scenarios, we're looking at just smaller scale solutions that could be done in those specific areas as a kind of a snapshot. But that's kind of a synopsis, and I'll go into it a little more in depth now. So again, scenario 1, we're trying to increase dam storage so that the dams can hold more water before they release them downstream. The way we did that is we looked at the national inventory of dams on the Massachusetts side only, and identified 14 dams that did not have anything to do with usage of hydroelectric, water supply, or flood control, because we figured we wouldn't really want to change how those dams are operating. We also looked at any non-jurisdictional dams as well. So 14 and 34, we looked at those 48 dams and identified their normal pool areas, how much area is taken up when the water is at its normal operating level. And we looked at what would happen if you had a foot of storage, a vertical foot of storage available when looking at that normal pool. So that could either be from pre-storm drawdowns, so lowering the dam by a foot before the storm hits, so you have that storage, or it could be done through raising the dam crest to have it have more room before it is overtopping. So that's kind of the spread across the watershed of those 48 dams. Now looking at the ordinance bylaw update, this one we wanted to, again, look at what would happen if any new development or land that is redeveloped needed to store up to the 100-year present day storm event. So the purple is all of the new development areas we identified to potentially, if you developed on this land, what would happen if you required them to store that rainwater. And then the pink is areas of redevelopment. So that is currently developed land that we looked at what would happen if that was redeveloped. And then just quickly going through how we screened for that. In the new development, we started with the whole watershed. We excluded any land in the Mass GIS open space and recreation layer. We excluded any land that wasn't listed as like open land, forest, agriculture, or recreation, because again, we're trying to find land that is undeveloped. We also excluded any land in the wetlands area and any land that was already in our current developed impervious layer. So that's how we kind of arrived at that. And then for our and then for the redevelopment, we made an assumption that of the currently developed land, it would be redeveloped at a rate of 1.5% per year. So we wanted to try to go with a pretty conservative amount. I believe for the eastern Massachusetts watersheds, we had gone with a higher redevelopment rate of 3%. So we tried to go with a more conservative 1.5% each year, which by 2070 would cause 50% of the current developed land to be redeveloped. So that was our assumptions going into this scenario. And then the upsizing the priority culverts. For this one, we wanted to look at the EcoShed Stream Crossing Explorer, which is a great webpage that we were able to look at and see which crossings had a prioritization score of 0.5 or higher. So we looked at those crossings and then went to our model and kind of pulled out which crossings we are currently modeling that have that prioritization score of 0.5 or higher from the EcoShed Stream Crossing Explorer tool. And we also threw in any NAC crossings that had a severe barrier categorization. But the majority of these were from the EcoShed tool. And we widened those culverts to either the modeled bankful width or the EcoShed bankful width, just depending on how big the original opening was. And so that was 84 crossings across the watershed. So kind of as a summary of what that looked like when we ran that through the model. So this is for the 2-year event. And what this is kind of showing is from the green, no action, that is our baseline year, to the dark blue, no action of year 2070. This is how much we expected the runoff volume to increase. And then the 3 following are what would happen if we implemented those 3 scenarios that I discussed. So for the dam storage, I know that this doesn't look super impressive on paper, but we did see that the increasing the dam storage has more noticeable effects at the local scale, which I'll get into later. The or new development does show a great effect across the watershed, but remember, again, this is like a watershed-wide coordinated effort. But if this was in theory done, it shows about a 70% reduction from the no action high dark blue to now the redevelopment light blue. And then for upsizing culverts, this one is not expected to have any effect on runoff volume. It's only having an effect on the rate or how the water flows through. So if it's being backed up earlier and held up and flowing over the road versus being allowed to flow under the road, but it's not changing the amount of water that is flowing out of the watershed itself, just how it's flowing out. So this one we will go into more of this overhead spatial view to kind of show these results a little bit better. And then this is just the same thing just for the 10-year event. So still kind of seeing a similar story of the re/new development having, I believe, a 65% reduction from the no action 2070 scenario. So again, that's how a summary of what's going on, but we can go now into more of a snapshot to kind of visually show a little better what's going on. So this is the South River sub-watershed here in the darker blue, and then the upper South River catchment is defined in that more pale blue in the top corner. So we wanted to analyze the effects of these scenarios at these 2 levels. So we're just going to zoom in into the Asheville Lake Dam area. So there's our dam. And we wanted to look at what would happen between the no action 2070 and then the 2070 with this implementation. So what the cells are showing here is the differences between those two max depth elevations. So the max depth of the 2070 10-year no action, 2070 10-year with these dams allowing more storage. So that's kind of what we're trying to show here. So blue is good. Blue means that our scenario reduced the water levels from up to a half foot in the light blue, or up to a half foot in the light blue, up to a foot in the slightly darker blue, and then more than a foot in the darkest blue. So for this one, you can see that we definitely create a bit more storage. So in the Upper South River catchment, we actually show a 25% reduction in runoff volume in the catchment scale. Looking at the whole sub-watershed, though, that I showed earlier, it's more of like a 3% reduction. So that's why we kind of wanted to show that really looking at analyzing the results at various scales can kind of show a different story, that really, even though at the larger scale, it doesn't look as effective, and the localized scale, it can be more effective. So that's for if we increase more storage within the dams. We can maybe see a half foot of reduction up to a foot just downstream of the dam. This is the second scenario, looking at redevelopment with bylaws. That like light green color is kind of showing areas that we identified as potential spots for new or redevelopment, which would hopefully store more water on them. And we can see that in the catchment, we actually reduce the runoff volume to a greater amount than what is currently presently occurring. So you can actually reverse the current rainfall effects if it was fully implemented. And then kind of very similar on the sub-watershed level, it almost is completely mitigating any future runoff volume that is occurring from climate change. So that's with our scenario 2. And then scenario 3, we want to show that there's 2 priority culverts we identified in this area, but they only really see benefits directly upstream. That's where you can see the slight little blue, because basically it's allowing the water to flow through and not back up, but it's not really showing anything super impressive outside of that. But it's kind of to show that different scenarios may work better in different areas of the watershed. So to that effect, we wanted to zoom in now to another area. So this is in the Shelburne Falls subwatershed, and then the catchment was kind of defined for that upper area where there's this Albert Davenport dam. And so doing a zoom in, there is the dam there, and it does allow more storage to be created, but not a large effect is seen in the stream to the right. That is that unnamed dam directly out of the stream. You can see the main Deerfield there still is showing kind of some fluctuations from stuff that is occurring upstream, but I'm trying to, if we zoom in just to that side channel, that there's not a great effect seen from increasing dam storage, just because the surface area of the dam is small relative to the runoff that is being generated. The bylaws and redevelopment one is a little more interesting, of course. It's showing a nice up to a half foot reduction near the school there and in those buildings. So we're trying to highlight how we could see a reduction in flooding at these buildings themselves. And again, in the catchment, it's mitigating beyond the present 10-year. So any effects that are being seen from climate change in this scenario are being mitigated. And then showing that blown out to the sub-watershed for Shelburne, it is also showing some great effects there. And what we wanted to show here is this is where the priority culverts are doing some good here. So the upstream is effectively being lowered. The upstream, it's not backing up as much. So the water is allowed to flow out more effectively through the widened culverts. And we can see in the hydrograph that the peak water surface elevation, the peak flow that is overtopping or entering the roadway for that one culvert is being reduced. So we are having a lower peak, and also the time that it is overtopping is reduced in that light blue line. So it's not overtopping for as long. So this is kind of like a zoomed in effect of what the priority culverts are doing. And then lastly, we wanted to look at the Cherry Run Brook area that's in our Bernardston subwatershed. There's not a catchment defined for this one since there's only one kind of hydrologic feature here. So this is all at the subwatershed level for this one in specific. Um, Same story here with the dams. There's only one dam upstream that was screened. And again, it's just not a large enough area to have a great effect here. So everything here is basically unchanged from the 2070 10-year no action. That's what we're showing here. Again, great story, of course, with the scenario two, with the bylaws updates. There's a lot of impervious, or there's a lot of developed land here already. If it's redeveloped, it will have a great effect in holding stormwater if the developed land is holding stormwater on site before allowing it to run down. So great reduction in runoff there. And then this is our kind of favorite scenario with the culverts in this spot. So there's 3 culverts that we identified as being priority culverts, and we widened them to their bank full width. And what we can see, especially in that middle culvert there, is that the time that it is overtopped, that road is having flow, is greatly reduced comparing the no action to our scenario. And again, you can see a lot of benefits of like up to a half foot, you know, upstream as well as downstream. There is some small areas of red directly downstream of the culverts just because more water is getting through faster. But we're hoping to combine this scenario with scenario 4 to kind of both have this great mitigation and also mitigate the downstream area. So I think Andy likes to say, have our cake and eat it too. So that's what's going on for those 3. I think we're going to turn it over to Emily to talk about the last 3.
Yeah, thanks, Sydney. Yeah, I will breeze through these pretty quickly because we're still sort of in development of the design for the more small scale nature-based solutions for the watershed. So I wanted to put this slide back up here. So Sydney just talked through scenarios 1 through 3, and I'm going to talk just very briefly for more of these sort of smaller scale nature-based solutions that would actually take place at a specific site. So the first 3 are on that watershed scale, and these are taking some of the priority areas that we identified earlier on in the project, and then, placing some specific nature-based solutions at a specific site. So I'll go just to the next slide, actually, Sydney, if you don't mind doing that. So these are the 3 more targeted solutions. So when we think about nature-based solutions, we're generally, as Sydney mentioned earlier, thinking of ways to sort of mimic the natural environment. So trying to take a site and change the hydrology back to maybe how it was before we had development at that site. Some of that comes with the redevelopment ordinance updates, as Sydney was talking about, of just trying to manage your own stormwater on site. But, in the cases of when something is already there, what do you do? So the first scenario that we talk about is the area that Sydney was just speaking about in the Cherry Rum Brook um, portion. So in addition to increasing the culvert size in those areas, we would want to, we're looking at areas to then put in some very, site-specific nature-based solutions to mitigate some of the larger scale flooding that might still be taking place. And so the types of solutions we're looking at here are basically things like, some floodplain restoration, a couple bioretention areas, and even something like a floodable field. Anything that we can do to have locations for that runoff to go during big events that then allow it to sort of soak into the ground or be held there for a little bit until then it can move downstream. And just also looking at areas within that plaza to determine, are there other places we could reduce impervious cover in general. So that's sort of what we're looking at there. But that really does need to be paired with the culvert improvements as well. The other 2 sites, scenario 5 and 6, we're really looking at site-specific nature-based solutions. The first is at the Asheville Town Beach. This one really looking to reduce the parking lot impervious area, add to the existing floodplain, improve any parts of the degraded channel to just sort of improve the resiliency of that channel, and then add additional bioretention. So for both of these, as well as scenario 6, we're not necessarily talking about one small bioretention area. We're talking about multiple practices to try to mimic that natural environment. And then the last site is the Green River Swimming and Recreation Area. Same kind of idea, basically looking at a parking lot redesign to reduce the runoff and total impervious area for that portion of the watershed, as well as something like a floodable field and some river restoration as well. So if you just want to go to the next slide, like I said, we're in development of these designs, but this is sort of, these are not the designs for this project. I wanted to pull some designs that, because we're working on them currently, but this is what you should be expecting to see for those three scenarios that I just spoke about. This is a different project we worked on, but it's the same idea of, where are we looking to do some improvements. That'd be sort of in the picture on the left, and then the picture on the right would be a little bit more detail about what type of concepts we would be expecting to put into the ground. So once we have developed this would be the next piece that we share. But like I said, they're in development, but that's sort of the areas that we're going with as well for now. So Sydney, if you just want to go to the next slide, and I'll just do key takeaways from this whole presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions if anybody has any. Based on the model results, the runoff volume in the watershed is projected to increase by, 29 to 59% by the year 2070. So this obviously, Sydney did a really good job and Andy did as well, sort of characterizing what's going to happen if we're not doing anything. Looking at watershed scale efforts can mitigate some of these increases in flooding, but we want to pair those with more site-specific nature-based solutions like we just talked about as well. So we really did, just because of this project we were working on, focused on mitigation actions on the Massachusetts side, not in Vermont. That doesn't mean that can't happen at a later time. But this will really help target a next step or a next phase of a grant application, because we've identified quite a few projects that could be implemented in the future. And again, this is a regional model that can be used as a building block to support design and permitting, and overall really adds a lot of value to the work that's being done by FERCog in this area as well. So I don't know if Andy or Sydney has anything else to add, but I think we can just open it up to questions if anybody has any about anything we talked about.
Thank you so much. Yeah, happy to start taking questions. Emily, go ahead.
Hey there. Great presentation. I'm so glad this is recorded. I'm going to watch it again and send a link to other folks. Question, a really simple thing that I'm just not sure what it would look like, but a project that would be increasing dam storage capacity. Can you give me an example? And I'm sorry if I missed that earlier on.
Yeah, I can give you two examples of that. Dam owners will do that generally in one of two ways. The first is to raise the dam crest, so that there's just more storage. So as the floodwaters kind of enter the impoundment, they can build up higher before they need to be released from the dam. An alternative is another way to do it is either to lower the spillway, which has the same effect, right? It creates more distance between the top of the dam and where the normal water line is, so it creates more flood storage. Another way to do that, maybe a little bit more innovative, is to use automated outlet controls, so valves that read down precipitation forecasts from NOAA probabilistic precipitation forecasts, and they will open and close the valves in real time based on the current impoundment level and the forecast. And so, right, if there's a 50% chance or maybe a 90% chance of 2 inches or more of rain in the next 24 hours, they'll actually open a valve and start bleeding water out of the impoundment. And so it lowers the impoundment in advance of a storm event and creates sort of pre-storm drawdowns and create flood storage that way. So there's a couple of ways to do it.
You can have a sort of a smart dam that's responsive.
Yeah, exactly. And we are seeing that done in Massachusetts and other states as well. And there's some equipment we've worked with. RTC is the name of the company that we've collaborated with, and one of the two companies we've collaborated with recently that develops the equipment and the software that helps facilitate that.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
They also stole somebody from my modeling team, but we won't get into that.
I have a question. I have a question for Andy. Andy, in developing your modeling, you chose 4 events to use as a basis to develop that. Did you look into the difference between a storm being generated out west, coming off in the Great Lakes, across the state of New York, and hitting our area, versus a storm coming up the coast that'll be more moisture laden because it's going over the ocean, and compare the averages of storms that come up the coast versus the storms that are generated inland? I would think, I'm not a meteorologist here, I don't know any of the facts and figures, but it would seem
Mhm.
like the storms coming up the coast would have more rainfall because of just where they came from and what they'd poured on us.
Yeah, cool question, Charlie. The short answer is that we took the average of all different kinds of storm events. So when we ran a hundred year rainfall event of today, or 100-year rainfall event of 2070, that includes storms of nor'easters and and storms coming across from New York and all kinds. You're right, there can be differences. We looked at an average for this phase, but the model that we've developed can be used to look at specific different types of meteorological events moving forward. You're muted there, Charlie.
I just said thank you to Andy for his
Okay.
explanation. Shortcut was a wave.
Awesome. Other questions? Emily, I see your hand up.
Yes, I have more questions. One is a sort of a comment or another thank you. This data is really helpful. Mass Woodlands Institute and their Land Trust have been working with Trout Unlimited, focusing on encouraging in work on headwater streams with floodplain reconnection in wood installation in the channel. And some of our work and research has been around just figuring out what the costs have been on the communities with things like Tropical Storm Irene, to put that sort of into perspective, and also thinking about the ways that work in headwaters up above the main stems could help release the pressure. And one of the things that has been documented is that it can magnify this kind of work that you're talking about, so that if there's increased roughness in the smaller order streams, that can really be beneficial. So I feel like it's really complementary. I hope any of that kind of data can be captured and add to your arguments. And then the other question that I had was, is there thought of putting this, I'm not sure what the deliverables will be for the model, but I hope that there can be some summaries or communications that can be given to towns and boards that are making the decisions about the overall, the decisions about what kinds of regulations they're going to be doing, because it definitely feels like we need to be able to summarize this in a way that communicates well so people can be informed about the decisions.
Yeah. One great point and one great question, Emily. Your first point about thinking about where projects or efforts are being spent. I always like to say that if you have $1 million to spend, and you can spend it upstream or you can spend it downstream, and it produces the same localized benefit, spend it upstream, because it will trickle down. And that's absolutely part of the genesis behind this sort of regional flood model and the regional effort that you all and FERCog are making. Stormwater does not respect municipal boundaries. So you got to take that into consideration as you're looking for solutions. So absolutely, upstream communities can help themselves, and they can help downstream neighbors as well. And there's lots of collaboration that can happen there between upstream and downstream neighbors. So right on. Your second question, yes, we're putting together a report that sort of summarizes all of the things we've just barely touched on today, and it'll go into quite a bit more detail. I think there'll be an executive summary, which I think will be really useful. You can hand the executive summary off, right? Nobody's going to read the entire report. Well, most people won't read the entire report. We're good writers, but not that good. No. So I think the executive summary will be really helpful, and that's something that you can pass on to municipal leaders and decision makers. Absolutely. And I know that FERCog is doing great work as well on that front. I don't know if you want to chime in on that, Allison, or others.
Yeah, I think, especially on the regulatory side and bylaws, and I imagine that's something that we'll want to continue working with communities on. And this is really just the start of, another decade of work. But I have a two-part question on the dams. The first being, I'm just wondering if those types of recommendations have been proposed and implemented elsewhere, and how complicated it is, if there's any regulatory requirements for increasing the storage capacity. And then second question, less fully formed, but I'm curious if the dams that you modeled with increasing the flood storage are dams that would be more likely to stay. So, for example, I don't see that dam being removed anytime soon, but there are other dams on the Green River that I know local conservation organizations are considering or potentially slated for removal. So how that impacts the potential for flood reduction.
Great questions. So this concept of pre-storm drawdowns or increasing flood storage capacity at existing jurisdictional dams, that's something that Massachusetts, I think, is still warming up to be honest with you. We've been involved with a number of watershed studies like this, and also a number of site-specific studies where this pond seems to, if we could do pre-storm drawdowns for this pond, it would have real meaningful benefits in the downstream channel, which has historically been flood prone. This is a good project, and we've then the next phase is to look at that in more detail, because the permitting agencies, wetlands in particular, they're going to want to know, okay, you do these pre-storm drawdowns. What happens if the rain doesn't actually happen? And now you've lowered the pond. Are there wetlands impacts there? Are you letting water, you're letting this water out from the dam ahead of a storm? Are you letting it out too fast, or are you making things worse downstream? Or are you spreading that out over time so it's so you're kind of getting a jump on that storm runoff? And so there's more detailed analyses that go into these to start to put together permit applications, and I'm currently in the process of supporting a couple of those. But full disclosure, that is something that's relatively new in Massachusetts. There are other countries and even other states that are more advanced is the wrong word. Experienced in looking at those projects, in part because they're more desperate. You think of countries like Holland. Any solution is a good solution, and so they've looked at those in more detail, and they have some more experience in that. And Massachusetts is coming around to those as well, and we're starting to see good traction for those types of projects. Your second question. Did we look at sort of the priority of some of these dams, which ones are going to be sticking around long enough to implement these types of projects? The short answer is no, we've not done that at this phase. We've really just tried to show that this type of strategy has some legs and could produce some catchment scale or even subwater scale benefits. And it's something to think about moving forward. We will often follow this up with a prioritization sort of evaluation. We'll look at criteria like, is this dam jurisdictional? Is it high hazard or is it low hazard? Is this dam currently in compliance, or does it need rehabilitation? Because if a dam needs rehabilitation, that's a good candidate for retrofitting. They've got to do something anyways. We'll look at things like endangered species habitat, the number of abutters, and so we'll look at 10 to 20 different sort of criteria and help come up with a prioritized list for the which specific dams might provide the greatest benefit or be most feasible in a particular watershed. And that's a nice next step.
Great. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I saw Andrew put a question in the chat. How does potential for flooding of a fire station in future scenarios land with people? Is there interest in exploring floodproofing, wet dry in those locations?
Ooh, good question. That kind of hints at a larger conversation about how to deal with climate change. This project has focused primarily on mitigation, perhaps more than many watersheds. I'm going to go out on a limb here. Please don't nail me to the wall for saying this. More than many watersheds in Massachusetts, that Deerfield has an opportunity for other options like adaptation, like wet and dry proofing, like Andrew has alluded to. You can imagine that some highly developed communities in eastern Massachusetts, they don't have a lot of places to migrate. It's very difficult to migrate uphill. The Deerfield watershed and its communities may be a little less constrained in that way. So the conversation about, do we mitigate and try to reduce the increased flooding, or do we adapt or retreat and try to accommodate the increased flooding? That's a more interesting conversation in your watershed. Mm-hmm. And in full disclosure, we focus more on the mitigation approach for this project.
Any other questions? Lots to digest. Yeah, thank you, Andrew, Sydney, and Emily. That was a great presentation. Really distilled down a lot of work and behind the scenes modeling. And yeah, really appreciate it. And I certainly will be watching that presentation again to digest it. But Audrey, do you want to talk about next steps?
Yeah, so for our coalition members who are on the call here, so our town representatives, we have a little bit more work to do now that the flood model is on its way to being done. We're going to come up with that top 20 list of priority projects based off of the results of the model. So we are going to be developing them over the next few weeks and drafting them. And we have a tentative meeting in 3 weeks from today. I think that's Thursday, June 4th at the same time. So we can all gather and review those. Our plan is to send them out in advance so you can review them. And also, if you can't make the meeting, yeah, you'll have them to review. And then from there, we'll finish up our report and call it a wrap for this year. On top of that, we also have our gift cards. So if you recall, people who are on the coalition who are not paid staff, so they're using all these meetings or helping us on volunteer time. To begin, you get gift cards based off of the hours that you've attended the meetings, or if we have provided homework to prep for the meetings or homework after the meetings. So I'll be sending an email out with forms to fill out on those shortly. And then after the meeting in June, you'll have to give them back to us. A pretty quick turnaround so we can process those before the end of June. So you'll hear more instructions on that from me via email. And that's all I have to announce.
Great. So yeah, I look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks, and we'll discuss more then. And as Weston and Sampson mentioned, we will be compiling a final report to summarize all of this, and then hopefully working over the next couple of years to continue implementing it. Great. All right. Thank you so much, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.
Great seeing everybody.